Muy buenas tardes a todos. Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a esta presentación de TecSalud. Hoy estamos con ustedes para platicar de un tema muy importante. Ciertamente estamos todos preocupados por la gran realidad que existe en esta epidemia actual. Esta pandemia ha puesto al mundo de cabeza en muchas formas, en Europa, en Asia, en Estados Unidos, en Canadá, y ahora en México se ha convertido probablemente en el problema de salud y económico más importante que muchos de nosotros hemos vivido y probablemente de los últimos 100 años. Esta realidad nos ha hecho entender la vulnerabilidad de todos los individuos con esta infección. Hemos también aprendido que probablemente la estrategia más importante hoy para prevención, aparte del distanciamiento físico, es la condición de salud en la que las personas que se infectan se encuentran. Ha sido incuestionable que en la experiencia asiática, europea y norteamericana, que el riesgo más importante de salud en la población es el estado de salud del individuo. Personas con enfermedades cardiovasculares, con hipertensión o con diabetes, han tenido un riesgo mucho mayor de su enfermedad, y eso nos hace tratar de cuestionar o de entender realmente en general nuestras actitudes y políticas de salud en el mundo y particularmente hoy en México. El objetivo de la conversación que vamos a tener ahora con Nina Teicholz es hablar un poco de una forma, una estrategia de salud que esté enfocada a mejorar nuestra nutrición, que esté enfocada a mejorar nuestra condición en general, que luego nos va a permitir no solamente afrontar esta epidemia, pero también la epidemia que tenemos de diabetes, de hipertensión y de obesidad, que en conjunto representan el riesgo más grande hoy en general. Esa es otra pandemia que vivimos, pero también pone a las personas hoy más susceptibles a la enfermedad del COVID. Nina es una periodista que ha hecho investigaciones muy importantes. Tiene un bestseller internacional que se llama The Big Fat Surprise, que revolucionó o ha cuestionado mucho del entendimiento que tenemos en general en cuanto a nuestras actitudes nutricionales. Nos va a compartir en los siguientes minutos su experiencia de una investigación muy rigurosa. Nos va a compartir un poco cómo se han escrito las guías nutricionales y cuál es esta realidad científica entre el consumo de proteína, de grasa y de carbohidratos. Nina ha sido, como ya les dije, es un bestseller. Tiene un libro que, si no lo han visto, se los recomiendo ampliamente. Es un libro fácil de leer, extraordinario, pero tiene un análisis y una investigación muy rigurosa, que realmente podríamos convertirlo como un libro de texto en las escuelas de medicina, pero es un libro que todo el mundo puede leer. Ha sido ella remarcada en el Economist, en el Wall Street Journal, y tiene una fundación que se dedica mucho a promover temas de mejores políticas y guías nutricionales. Ella se graduó de Stanford y de Oxford y ahorita se encuentra en cuarentena en Connecticut. Ella está en una zona de las que fueron más afectadas en Nueva York, y voy a cambiar ahora a inglés para poder hacer una introducción un poquito hacia ella. Nina, welcome. I have the pleasure of introducing you to our audience, and I did that, of course, in Spanish, and we're switching now to English. And I basically share with everyone that the objective of our conversation is to highlight the importance of good nutrition as one of the mechanisms not only to stay healthier, but also it's perhaps one of the best preventive strategies other than social distancing in our fight against this deadly virus that's putting the world around. But I also like to tell you and to all our audience that our approach at TecSalud has been, and it was, refocus on our strategy on prevention, wellness, and longevity. So I think this underscores the opportunity to talk about nutrition and better health, not only to fight COVID, but also to decrease the equally bad epidemic of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. All of those are linked, and all of those worsen the probability of someone to fight COVID in a better way. So without any further ado, I will pass the microphone to you, and thank you for taking time to share your experience and your research with us this afternoon. Thank you, Nina. I will pass the microphone to you.
Muchísimas gracias. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí con todos ustedes y esta tarde. Y I am not going to speak all in Spanish, pero voy a tratar en algunas partes. Pero I have to say to begin with, this question of being healthy in the time of COVID-19, to be personally healthy is your best strategy of defense against this disease, because the rates of hospitalization, poor outcomes, mortality, which is death, from the virus are much higher among people who suffer the diseases that are related to diet, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And so I'm going to talk about what is a strategy to make yourself as healthy as possible. But I have to start by talking about how we came to our current ideas about what is a healthy diet. Because most of us believe that to be healthy, we need to minimize fat, and especially the saturated fat in meat and dairy, and maybe people believe avoiding eggs is also important. And the work of my book was to go back and investigate where do these ideas come from? Why do we believe this? I myself believed it. So I want to first take a little bit of time to explain why we believe what we believe about a healthy diet, and then show you what the evidence is for that. And then we can talk about a different kind of diet that is actually much more powerful for improving your health and protecting you against disease. So let's just start off. This is my book. También existe en español. Fue publicado en México. No, la grasa no es como la pintan. That's from Random House, I think was the publisher. So you can get this book in Spanish. And what is my background? Why am I doing? It's important to say that I was for 25 years a vegetarian. So I did not ever think I would publish a book with a picture of meat on the cover. I did not eat red meat for all that time. I'm from Berkeley, California, which some of you know is sort of one of the central places of vegetarianism. It took me almost 10 years, 10 años of research to get to the bottom of this story, reading thousands and thousands of scientific studies. And I think it's also important to let you know that I receive no industry funding. I'm not connected to any kind of industry of any kind. And I started because, as many of us wonder, this is obesity in America, but we know there is a picture like this for every country in the world practically, where at some point obesity rates and diabetes started to increase dramatically. Why is that? And this was a question that I asked myself, and I started to focus on the question of fat. Good fat, bad fat, how much fat, what? Because many of us grew up thinking, the way to be thin is to avoid fat. The way to be healthy is to avoid fat. So I looked into that in my book. And this is really how it all started. And I'm sorry to say it started in my country, but you have to understand, in the early 1900s, as you can see in this slide, there was almost no heart disease in America. And it was true around the world. And then heart disease started to rise very quickly. And President Eisenhower, our president, had a heart attack and was he was in bed and out of his office for 10 days. That happened in 1955. And people did not know what caused heart disease. And it was terrifying to people. And there were various ideas. Maybe it was vitamin deficiency. Maybe it was a type A personality that you yelled at people and then you just all the time, and then you just drop dead. Or it was more and more auto exhaust that was becoming more common. But there was one idea proposed by this man, Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist at the the University of Minnesota, and he said that it was saturated fat and cholesterol. So that these two, if you ate them, would elevate or raise the cholesterol in your blood and then clog your arteries. So to fill up your arteries, your blood vessels, and give you a heart attack. And that was called the diet heart hypothesis. And he was a very powerful man. And so the first recommendation anywhere in the world was to lower your saturated fat, cut back on meat and dairy, came out of the American Heart Association in 1961. This is the tiny little kernel that becomes the giant tree of advice that we have today. And this meant in practice, cutting out meat and cheese and eggs and butter and switching over to margarine and vegetable oils. That was what it was. It meant, and this is what many of us believe today, that these oils are more healthy. And I just want to remind everybody our history, and the history también en Mexico, was to cook with lard and butter. Those were the main cooking fats. And vegetable oils were really used to lubricate machinery that after they had killed all the whales, they turned to cotton seeds and made them into oils. And they started using those oils for the Industrial Revolution. It was never meant to be a food product until actually it started as Crisco, which was a kind of hardened vegetable oil. But in any case, Ancel Keys was very influential. This is a cover of Time magazine in 1961, and his idea was adopted widely by everybody. And his idea was that it was saturated fats that was bad for you and would cause heart disease, but eventually it expanded to all fats. So by 1970, we had advice to avoid all fats. And the reason to avoid fat was fat has about 9 calories per gram versus the other two things you can eat, which is carbohydrates or protein. Those have 4 calories per gram. And so they thought, if we avoid fat, we won't get fat. Fat makes you fat. But what was the evidence for this? At the time, there really was, in the 1960s, there was really only one study by Ancel Keys called the 7-country study, which was mainly in Europe, but also in the US and Japan. And what Ancel Keys found was that the people who ate less saturated fat had less heart disease. But this was only an epidemiological study, which means it can show association, but not causation. It can't show cause and effect. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this problem. Associations can often be wrong. Look at this chart, for example. It shows that if you eat less margarine, you're less likely to get divorced in Maine. So do we think this is true? No, we do not. But there are often associations that are not, they go together, but one does not cause the other. And so I want you just to take a little screenshot of this particular slide for a number of excellent, there's a YouTube video by a Stanford professor, John Ioannidis, and some articles you can read on epidemiology and why it is so unreliable, because most of the studies that you see in the newspaper, red meat is linked to cancer, whole grains is linked to better cardiovascular health. All of those, when they say linked to, that is an epidemiological study and is not reliable. So this is a big problem in our understanding of nutrition. But nutrition scientists in the 1970s knew that Ancel Keys' argument was weak. And so they set out to try to prove his hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis. Is it true that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease? And there were a number of very, very large clinical trials that were funded by governments all over the world, up to 12 years long. And they were actually on more than 25,000, probably ultimately about 75,000 people were tested. The results, saturated fat had no effect on death from heart disease, cardiovascular mortality, or total mortality, no effect at all. So that is probably the most tested hypothesis in the history of heart disease. And the results were what they call in science null, meaning there's no result. meaning the reason that we've been avoiding meat, the reason we've been avoiding regular milk, regular natural foods, there was no cause for that. And here's a very famous scientist from Canada saying, it appears from his study, which is the largest, it is an epidemiological study, but they found that saturated fats was protective against stroke. And then this is just a brief slide. Again, you can just take a picture of it to show that they also tested the low fat diet. What happens when you just reduce fat overall? You try to stay away from fat, and they could not find, these are large studies funded by our government. They could not find any benefit at all from reducing fat. No benefit for weight loss, no benefit for preventing diabetes, no benefit for cancer, no benefit for avoiding heart disease. So, and I want to just say, I think that this is our government and what we recommend here, but you can see that we still recommend what many would consider to be a low-fat diet. We have 3 versions of it, but it's all the same, where fat is relatively low. It's in the low 30% of calories, 34% of calories. And carbohydrates, let's be clear, what is a carbohydrate? Carbohydrates are bread, pasta, rice, candy, sugars. Those are all glucose, sucrose, any of those sugars, those are all carbohydrates. We are told to eat more than half of our calories. And this is true across the world, really, these kinds of recommendations. And if you look again at that chart, when did obesity start? That began in America with our government recommendations really began the very year that we started to have an obesity epidemic, which has not stopped since. And you can see that big bottom slab of the pyramid is all carbohydrates, bread, pasta, grain, cereals. That's what we were told to eat. Are there other nutritional options? And this is where we're going to talk about, well, if this low-fat diet is not supported by good evidence, what else should we do? What should we do? Where is the evidence? And here's this new hypothesis. It's called, well, this is not a formal name, but it's the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. And the idea is, if you eat carbohydrates, these cookies, crackers, bread, when it enters your body, it all becomes sugar in your blood. So all of this becomes sugar. And then if you do this all day long, you have cereal, even oatmeal for breakfast, and you have fruit as a snack, and you have a sandwich for lunch, and you have pasta for dinner, your body is constantly having sugar in the blood. And every time sugar is in your blood in the form of glucose, your body has to make something called insulin, which is a hormone. And you need the insulin to take the glucose and put it, when you're a healthy person, it puts the sugar, the glucose, in your muscle cells. And then your body will say, oh, I've got all this sugar in my muscle cells. I need to go around and exercise or walk around. But when your muscle cells get exhausted from having too much sugar, they become what's called insulin resistant. They can no longer take any more insulin. Then your body starts to make fat cells. And the insulin puts the glucose in the form of fat. It stores it in your fat cells. So, and that's what it causes, according to this hypothesis, obesity. And over time, as your blood sugar goes up and down with every cracker and piece of bread and every sugary fruit, over time, even your fat cells become resistant to insulin, and your sugar spills over into your blood, and that is when you are diagnosed with diabetes. Diabetes is when your body can no longer process sugar. And another way of thinking about it is your body can no longer tolerate carbohydrates anymore. This is where we come to talk about, let's talk about the evidence supporting this theory. People think there's very little evidence for this theory. And that's because it is relatively unpopular in the mainstream medical establishment, which has for so long believed in a low-fat diet. A diet that is low in carbohydrates is high in fat. So this is a very uncomfortable idea for many people to think about having a diet that is much higher in fat than they're used to. Higher in fat, maybe a little higher in protein. So, but there's quite a lot of evidence, as you can see here. And hopefully in the comment section, there's going to be, they're going to publish some of the resources you can go to find the list of all of these clinical trials. All of it is documented. That's why I don't have it up here. But the diet is shown always in experiments to help people lose more weight compared to a low-fat diet or any other diet. If you keep your carbohydrates very low, that's called a ketogenic diet. It's enables people to keep their weight and help them reduce weight even over the long term. You know, most diets, people start to regain weight at 6 months or so. But the reason that this diet is able to be sustained for a longer period of time is that when you are eating fat and protein, you are satiated. You do not have hunger. If you have that blood sugar going up and down, every time the blood sugar goes down, that makes you hungry. So you'll notice that on a diet that is high in carbohydrates, if you have cereal for breakfast, you are hungry by 10:30 in the morning. If you have eggs for breakfast, you may find you're not hungry till even at lunchtime because you are not having that blood sugar go up and down. This diet is also the only diet, aside from a starvation diet, that has been shown to reverse a diagnosis of diabetes. And that's very important. It doesn't reverse entirely the condition, but it brings down people's blood sugars to a point where they are no longer considered to have diabetes, type 2 diabetes I'm talking about. And that is, and this happens, there's an experiment going on 3 years now where in the first 10 weeks, they were able to cut the rate of diabetes by half in their population of about 260 people. And this is at the University of Indiana. And at 3 years, they had sustained those results, which is incredible to think that you can cut diabetes by half in a population. Diabetes is one of the most expensive diseases for any government or any health company. And it is also one of the most painful and awful diseases in terms of all of its terrible side effects. It makes people go blind and have limb amputations, and a number of other things. So this diet is quite promising. And this is where I want to turn to the conversation about COVID-19, because the data coming out on COVID-19, and again, there's other data that we're sharing in the comment section of the show, but they're finding in countries all over the world that people with one of the diet-related conditions, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, all of these diseases increase the likelihood of being admitted to a hospital, and then increase the likelihood of having bad outcomes once you're in the hospital, and then also increases the likelihood of death. And it's very important. I mean, this is so upsetting that in the United Kingdom, the health minister there has launched an urgent probe, an urgent investigation into this question of, is obesity related? How is obesity related to poor outcomes for COVID-19? I mean, you can just imagine, as a thought experiment, if we had half the rate of, even just half the rate of chronic disease that we have, if we could bring it down, we might not all be in lockdown. If we were healthier to fight this virus, then it might be that we would not have, we would not be so susceptible, so vulnerable, so fragile to this disease. And this is, where we are waiting maybe a year or more for a vaccine, and we're unsure of treatments. And the best thing that any of us can do, and even as countries we can do, is to try to make us less vulnerable to this disease. So what do all these diseases have in common? They all have, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, they all share, they're all sort of from a common root, a source, which is this thing of insulin resistance, when your body can no longer tolerate the amount of carbohydrates that are coming into your body. And in fact, one of the more recent findings that they're seeing about the virus is that it may not be the fact of being obese. It may be simply your blood sugars, having such high blood sugar all the time. They're finding that one of the strongest association with improving your outcomes once you're in the hospital is to, this is a study that was two studies, but one was done in China on over 7,000 people. They said the most important factor was bringing down your blood sugar. Anybody can bring down their blood sugar in a matter of, really in a matter of weeks. And the way that you bring down your blood sugar is very simple. You simply do not eat sugar itself. So the obvious things like, candy, but you also do not eat the things that turn to sugar in your blood. So, and some of these are not obvious to people. I mean, we know about bread and cereal and pasta, but people don't realize that also fruit, especially sugary fruit, will spike your blood sugar. I was shocked when I started monitoring my blood sugar. I would take my blood and, at every for a while, just to study myself, I was doing it every hour, and I couldn't believe that a single tiny little mandarin orange spiked my blood sugar more than a piece of candy did. So to keep your blood sugar low turns out to be one of the most useful things that you can possibly do to make yourself healthy in the time of COVID-19. So this is something that I think we should chat about. I mean, I think it's extremely important to talk about this new idea of a diet. It's called a low carbohydrate diet. If it's very low, it's called a ketogenic diet. It is viewed with suspicion by many. People don't understand it. There are many questions about it. And I think this would be a great thing to talk about together. I can launch in with my own, my own question and answers. I know many of the questions about the diet, but maybe we should do this together.
Sure. Thank you, Nina. I'm going to start by asking you, I probably did not give a lot of time to introduce you in a way that is important for the audience to see it. And I've seen many of your presentations, I've read your book. I want you to tell the audience, why is it that you became so interested? How many years did it take you to do your research to get to the book? And I am going to tell everyone that I would highly recommend the book, because the book is a compendium of scientific data that, but just tell me, just to start the conversation like this, and then we'll go into more. How long did it take you to do your research into your book?
Yes. Well, I was assigned a magazine article to look into the subject of trans fats. And this is back in this is almost 20 years ago. And I started to look, as I said, have obsessed about most, right? What kind of fat, good fat, bad fat. Scientists, were very rigorous. And I found was I would talk to scientists who were afraid to talk to me, or they would say, I'm not sure if this is working. Can you see me? Okay.
Yes, I can see you just fine.
I thought it was a little shaky there. So there were scientists who would say things like, I'm afraid to talk to you. I can't talk to you. I cannot talk to you on the subject of fat, and would hang up the phone on me. Or people who said that their papers had been or that their careers had been destroyed for challenging the ideas that we have about fat. And I realized there was just a huge story here. And it was not
It froze? Or...
so fear in this scientific community. As a journalist, you know there's a story there. So it took me almost a decade I really went down what we call a rabbit hole. I think I'm a little obsessive compulsive, and I had to read every single study going back to the 1920s on fat. Where do these ideas come from? And you go to one scientific paper and you look at all the references, and then you think, I have to read all those papers. And so you just keep going back and back in time. It's like you're digging down to the bottom. And when you dig down to the bottom, to the data itself, to the numbers, to the actual experiments, you realize that there was nothing there. There was like people had lied about their data. And then some data had been buried, and some data had never been published, and some data, was sitting in basements that had not been published. That this idea that saturated fat are bad for you had been so powerful that scientists who found anything to the contrary, they buried their own data because they knew it would ruin their careers. There are many examples in the book of this, and it's fascinating to see how the science is literally is suppressed, so that scientists themselves did not publish their data, and so they did not publish their studies. Huge studies that went unpublished for years and years. And when I talked to some of these scientists, and they said, I said, why did you not publish your study? This is an enormous study. It was funded by the government. And they said, well, there was nothing wrong with it. We were just so disappointed with the way it came out. So this is called selection bias. And it is amazing to see that this is the foundation of everything that we believe to be true.
Yeah, no, I would encourage everyone, and I'm going to tell this in Spanish just to make sure that everybody follows clearly, Nina. Y yo realmente invitaría a todos a que vieran y pusieran atención en su libro, porque la documentación científica de los hallazgos es muy relevante y es un trabajo de muchos años. Yo he tratado de ir a los artículos originales después y esto te provee de una gran cantidad de material muy, muy relevante. Nina, I want to switch a little bit to the idea of insulin, and it is really important for, I think, all of us to understand, especially because we're really fighting two pandemics, right? We have a pandemic of obesity. You may or may not be aware of this, but Mexico is ranked #1 in childhood obesity. And today we've seen more and more data from New York that kids in the US are manifesting a systemic inflammatory condition associated with the virus. And I have to tell you that I'm very concerned that we may see a similar phenomenon in Mexico, because childhood obesity is a huge problem, and obesity drives inflammation. And one of the components of the cascade of the COVID-19 illness is a massive inflammatory response. So that if you have obesity, high insulin production, activation of inflammation, and on top of that, you get that infection, you may potentiate a component of the illness that may be much more severe in children. And I read with attention the policy of the UK, and I was really excited by someone paying attention to this, because I think we are seeing today in Mexico a higher mortality associated with those individuals that end up in the hospital. And I think, and I've said it publicly in many settings, that the reason why we see that is because our prevalence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all of those have in common, and perhaps is the single most important risk condition, is obesity. So I think it is a very important problem, and I would hope that after these conversations we bring that up to everybody's attention, because we talk about prevention of COVID-19 and of course all the cardiovascular conditions. Well, at the bottom line is our nutritional attitude and how we behave in many different ways, but nutrition is clearly one of those. Nina, I have a couple of questions here, and let me see. One is by Alonso Ballesteros, and he's asking, his question is, what is your opinion on the obesity code? I don't know what that means, but maybe you know that, or you can follow that.
The obesity code and the diabetes code are by Dr. Fung, who is a Canadian, a doctor from Canada. I actually wrote the foreword to his second book, so I know him very well. I think he's an excellent doctor, and he uses a low carbohydrate approach for his patients, and so I think his book is very good. He explains the problem of insulin resistance very, very well. I think he's an excellent person to read. He also is somebody who introduced, is really the leader of something called intermittent fasting, which is to say that you don't eat. You know, we were taught, all of us, to have many small meals all throughout the day. But his idea is quite different, which is that you should fast and not eat during long periods. Like even if you just don't eat until lunch every day, skip your breakfast, or maybe go a whole day without eating. But the idea is it all goes back to insulin, as you say, because when you are eating, you have this insulin response. So you eat something with glucose in it, and your body produces insulin. As long as you have insulin in your body, you have inflammation, and you have, it also prevents you from using up your own fat stores, your own fat, your body fat. You know, your body fat is there. It's like having granola bars on your body. It's like having food on your body. You use your fat is great when you need energy. But when you cannot get to your own fat, you cannot burn your own fat when you have insulin circulating in your blood. So the idea of not eating is to bring down your insulin, bring it down for as long as possible. And so you have as long as possible to not have insulin, not have inflammation, and also that during that time, you can burn your own fat as energy. Your fat, you use your own body fat as energy. So if you want to lose weight, it turns out that is an excellent way to lose weight.
Thank you, Nina. I think you just answered another question that actually a friend of mine asked, Carlos Sada, asked that question: how many hours should people fast? So I think you said, well, maybe, I don't know, is it 14, 16, 18 hours?
Well, it's very individual. I mean, I personally do not eat before noon. That seems to me to be reasonable. I would not want to skip dinner. Other people will fast for 24 hours, but I think I will say one thing. It is very hard to fast if you are not on a low carbohydrate diet, because you need to, in order to be successful fasting, and I mean, what I mean by this is not to be starving all the time, but to be comfortable not eating. You need to have your body become what is called a fat burner. That means you need to be able to burn your fat for energy, right? There's two kinds. Do I have time to explain? There are two kinds of fuel that your body can use.
Yeah, we're good with time, Nina. We have another 20 minutes.
Okay, so your body is like a hybrid car. Your body can use two fuel sources. One is glucose, sugar. If you are a glucose burner, you're the kind of person who you have your bowl of cereal and then you are really hungry and then you need to have more food. And then because you always get your food from glucose, some form of carbohydrate. If you cut down on that glucose, your body over time, And I'm saying maybe over 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, we'll develop an ability to burn fat instead, or to be specific, ketone bodies. But to burn your fat, that means burning the fat on your body. You need to upregulate enzymes, and your metabolism has to change. And it can be uncomfortable to make this transition. But if you are a fat burner, you are somebody who always has food, your body, you always have energy right there. So you can fast very easily, because your body immediately, like a hybrid car, it immediately switches over to burning fat. And then you have no problem going for long periods of time not eating. You forget about food. It seems almost unimaginable to people who are not used to it, but it's like you forget to eat because your body has its own fat.
So I have to tell you personal experience. And,
Yeah.
prior to this pandemic, I was training to do a very strenuous hike. It's called rim to rim to rim in the Grand Canyon. And I go to people that are older than me. I'm almost 60. So these guys.
That's very impressive. I've done that.
So these guys are 65 and 70. One of those is a former US Marine, and the other one just trains really hard. And I was eating, I have never really paid too much attention. I eat healthy, and we can talk about a balanced diet in a moment. But I was never really too low carb because I love bread and pasta and so forth. But for the last 6 months, I said, I'm going to eat very low carbs because I became more aware. And frankly, I wanted to lower my cardiovascular risk. That's, I'm a cardiologist and I take care of people that are sick. And I said, I just don't want to have heart disease, right? And I did it for that reason. So before my changing to a diet like that, I would run really hard in the morning or go hiking. And I would come back. And if I was in a diet with reasonable with carbs, so maybe more carbs than what perhaps a normal person would eat, I would have to eat within 20 minutes of my exercise. And I would feel my blood sugar drop and I feel like passing out if I would not eat like that a lot. But then I switched to very, very low carbs, really very minimum. And carbs in terms of maybe lots of vegetables, but no bread, no pasta, no rice, no beans like that, no potatoes. And then what happens is I eat late because Mexicans, we all eat late, but I train really hard in the morning. I go most of the morning without eating anything until about 1 o'clock. And no problem. And I could do all that and training for at least an hour really hard in the morning. So what you said, I've lived through it personally. So if you train your body to start using fat, you won't feel that you're going to these deeps with a lot of just this anxiety of eating and these low blood sugar symptoms that are real that you can avoid if you train your body to use fat sources. So I just wanted to say that is when you just reminded me, which I lived through that. And I honestly, I don't know what is it that we need to measure in our body to notice that you'd switch, but that is an absolute phenomenon. Now
you measure ketones. If you want to know, you can get a little ketone meter and you can measure your ketones, and that's how you know. But people often will say, oh, the low carbohydrate diet doesn't work. I felt terrible. Because there's all these changes going on, and you really need to make that transition carefully. And so you sometimes, and if you are taking medication, you also come off your medication very quickly. So it is advisable to do that with a doctor. People come off their insulin very quickly. They come off their blood pressure medication very quickly. And so, and you need to take salts because you need more salt. So you need to be careful if you're really going to make that kind of transition.
So I have quite a few questions. I'm going to try to lump them, but I have a couple from very important people. And my wife asked a question, so I have to ask you, otherwise I'll probably be in trouble. And so she wants to know, why is it that if we eat high levels of fat, how come we won't have high cholesterol levels?
Right. Well,
if I answer,
hola, buenas tardes.
Deal with that question.
La mujer de Guillermo. It's that your body cholesterol is a molecule, is a substance in every cell of your body. You need your cholesterol to make hormones, to make your brain function properly. You need it for many things in your body. Cholesterol is normal and it is needed for many functions. Your body will regulate its own cholesterol. So your body keeps your cholesterol constant. So if you eat a lot of cholesterol, which actually, it's mainly the cholesterol in eggs that will raise your cholesterol. But if you eat a lot of cholesterol, your body will produce less. Your body makes its own cholesterol. So if you eat a lot, your body doesn't produce it. Your body stays in homeostasis, it's called. What's the word in Spanish? Homeostático. Anyway, but in the same way that if your body, you sweat so that you keep a constant temperature, or you shiver to keep a constant temperature, your body will work to keep a constant level of cholesterol in your blood. And it's only some people who have a genetic condition who have a real problem with not being able to control their cholesterol. And it's really important to know that if you bring your cholesterol too low, we're taught to bring down our cholesterol, bring it down. Well, there's two things I want to say about that. One is that the data on women is different. Women with high cholesterol have always been shown to live longer. And I mean total cholesterol now. And that data was never really reported because they thought it was too complicated to have. In the 1970s, it was all men scientists. So they never really talked about that data. Yeah, and the other thing is that once your cholesterol gets too low, it is associated with, or perhaps causes, you're at higher risk of stroke. And this is seen in cerebral hemorrhaging, which is seen in countries that have very low cholesterol, such as Japan, and also in experiments where they lower cholesterol.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to follow that question again. My wife is very happy that you answered that.
Okay.
So, Nina, there are quite a few questions. One from Bobby Cano, the other one from Rodolfo Rubio, who's my colleague, and they want to know, how do you put this Mediterranean diet in context with what you've just described? They say Mediterranean diet has been around for a long time. People live a long, Mediterranean people are happy, and they smoke and they do a lot of things and drink a lot of wine, and they live a long time. So what would you say about that?
Yes, there is a whole chapter on La Dieta Mediterránea in my book, and I really suggest you read it. The Mediterranean diet, as it actually exists in the Mediterranean, if you go to Greece or Spain or Italy, they eat plenty of meat and fat. They are not afraid of those foods. And if you look at the Mediterranean diet experiments, they're actually mostly much higher in fat. They're up to 40% fat, or 39% fat was the famous Mediterranean diet experiment in Spain that was done. So they're higher in fat, and they're also not low in meat. The diet as it's actually exists and as it's studied, but the way it has been translated by our officials in the United States, and this is mainly at Harvard, they just couldn't imagine such a high fat diet. So they made their own version of the Mediterranean diet, which was low fat, no meat. And this is really the Harvard researchers who did this, but it does not reflect the actual experimental, and by that I mean the clinical trial data is a higher fat diet that's higher in meat than the one that is sort of told to us to follow. So the data on Mediterranean diets is a higher fat diet. And it's the sort of the so-called, this idea that they ate no fat and they ate no meat. Those are data, like I know very, very well, I don't want to go into detail, but like the data from Crete, where Ansel Keys went there. And one of the times he went there to study, he went during Lent, when nobody was eating any animal foods for Lent. So the data is just very unreliable from many of those places. And it's all sort of one point in time, what we call ecological data, which is a very weak kind of data compared to the clinical trial data, which is a higher fat diet.
Yeah, no, I read that in your book and I think it's very good. And I would encourage people to read it. Now, I have a special guest here with me who wants to ask you a specific question, and I'm going to have her ask you the question because of your history. So I'm going to have Sophie here. Because of social distancing, I'm going to move away so that she can come into the camera.
Okay. Hola, Sophie.
How are you? I am just curious. So I am a vegetarian, like pescatarian, and I would like to know, like, from your personal experience, what changes have you noticed from changing your diet over the years to now, like a low carb and you eat meat and all that type of diet changes?
Yes, this is a very important question. So what I have found, first of all, when I started to eat more protein and meat and lower carbohydrates, I effortlessly lost weight. So that was one thing. I also stopped getting sick. I just stopped completely. I used to get sinus infections and I used to get colds. I have to knock on wood. I haven't been sick in years. My moods are much more stable. I used to take medication for being depressed, and that stabilized completely. And I used to have, when I was younger, I had, my face had all kinds of spottiness on it. My skin got much better. So it doesn't look like you have any of those problems, but I will tell young people who I know that the vegetarian diet is very, very popular. Your body does store nutrients in it. So, and it's very good that you're eating fish because omega-3s you cannot get from plant food, but there are other nutrients that you cannot get from plant foods like vitamin B12, other B vitamins. And you can't get the proper form of retinol for your eyes. So over time, and I'm saying years, people find that their bodies on a vegetarian, especially a vegan diet, people find their bodies, they use up all the nutrients that they've stored and their bodies start to break down. And they usually see it in terms of digestive problems or mood problems, but they become very, their bodies start to break down in various ways. And that's why, I was shocked to find this. There's a whole community of vegetarian people on YouTube who have millions of followers. And in the last year alone, half of them, what we call deplatformed. They left their channels because they could not, they were found eating animal foods because they were not healthy. And they said, I can't stay healthy on this diet. So it concerns me for young people. When you're young, you can do anything. But over time, it's hard for your body to stay healthy on that diet. And sometimes it doesn't show up for a while. If you do stay on that diet, many people do it for ethical reasons, and I understand those. It's very, very important to supplement, particularly with vitamin B12.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, gracias a usted.
Okay, so I'm gonna let Sophie go, but I want to maybe take the last couple of minutes. We're gonna have to wrap and finish here shortly, Nina, but there are a few questions about this concept of genetic assessment for the possibility of giving good advice in nutrition. Do you find in your research, or have you noticed, or do you have any recommendations for those that want to have a nutrigenomics assessment to try to define your body as, and this is a question for one of my colleagues, Eduardo de Obeso, who's a cardiologist, and I think that will be a pretty important question.
Yes. Okay, Eduardo, lo siento, pero creo que estos testes no vale la pena. And that is because the data that we have on diet for different kinds of, for people is, we just don't have enough data. There's just not nearly the kind of data that we would need to make that meaningful. And I will say it's especially important to understand that people on a regular sort of balanced diet have a completely different metabolism and respond differently to all kinds of things than do people who are on a lower carb diet. So the way you respond to foods has everything to do with your metabolism and very little to do with your genetics, except for things at the very, like the, lactose intolerance, maybe gluten intolerance. But those tests I do not think are meaningful, because the major changes in metabolism come with changing your diet. So there's only a few things that are very, very marginal that I think are helpful. The big changes that you see come with changing your diet.
Nina, just to wrap up, I'm curious to what is it that your coalition is doing today to try to work with
my advocacy work? Yes. Well, I run a group called the Nutrition Coalition, and we are trying to change we are trying to ensure that the dietary guidelines in the United States, which are very influential all over the world, we were the first country to have dietary guidelines, that they're based on rigorous science. And by that, I mean that they're based on, good clinical trial data. The doctors in your audience know that they would not prescribe a drug to their patients without clinical trials. But we prescribe diet based on very weak evidence. And we do that, and we give everybody a one-size-fits-all diet, which is not, somebody with type 2 diabetes cannot eat the same thing as somebody who is healthy and fit and young. So our group is trying to work to ensure that our policy is based on good evidence. I mean, as you could remember from those charts, why do we have a low-fat diet still if all those tests show that it could not help people improve their health? Mm-hmm. Why is that? So we're trying to change government policy, which is much harder than writing a book.
No, I know, but it's very important. And I want to follow that comment to close our conversation, because I think that what I think is really important is to acknowledge the fact that our behavior and our habits are so critical for what happens to us over years. And if we learn good behavior and good habits, we're going to be much better prepared for a COVID-19-like illness in the future. But also at the same time, we will be fighting the illnesses that are killing us every day, which today we talk about COVID-19, but there is no question that cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and if you lump those together, it'll be the number one cause of death and premature death, preventable death, which is really, it's all about our habits, and our habits are things that we have control of, like diet, like exercising, like not smoking, and those things are so critically important. I will close just by telling our audience in Spanish a final comment, if you don't mind.
No, por supuesto.
Yo quisiera simplemente nada más recordarles que esto que acabamos de revisar ahora es una visión muy importante. Hay múltiples estrategias de cuidar la salud. Esta es una de ellas, con información muy sólida, científica, y vuelvo a repetirles, creo que es muy importante que aquí algunos de ustedes que están preocupados por los títulos, que revisen el libro. El libro tiene evidencia científica sólida. Y yo creo que a final de cuentas la conversación que esto nos ha permitido es hablar de un tema que es relevante. Es relevante porque nutrición se convierte en uno de los pilares más importantes para combatir las enfermedades crónicas, que es lo que está matando hoy al mundo, independientemente de cómo está potenciando el daño de COVID-19. Y en TecSalud estamos totalmente comprometidos a hablar de estos temas, a buscar estrategias que promuevan bienestar, prevención y longevidad. And with this, Nina, I will close, and I thank you for your time and your attention. And for all of our audience, I like to extend my gratitude y a todos ustedes les agradezco el tiempo que estuvieron aquí con nosotros. Muchas gracias, Nina.
Gracias a usted. Y ustedes.